The child on stage didn't speak, but what they said shook the entire world. Simon Cowell sat at the judge's desk, arms crossed, wearing that expression everyone knew too well, the one that said he'd seen it all, heard it all, and wasn't easily impressed. The audience buzzed with anticipation. Another act, another performance, another night on America's Got Talent. But something was different. The stage lights dimmed to a single spotlight, and a small figure walked to center stage alone. No music. No introduction. Just a child, no more than 9 years old, standing in silence. The audience fell quiet, confused. Simon leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. Howie glanced at Heidi. Sophia looked at the producers offstage, as if waiting for an explanation. And then, the child's hands began to move. Slow. Deliberate. Graceful. Sign language. The child was deaf. And they had come to America's Got Talent not to sing, not to dance, but to deliver a message the world needed to hear. A message that would stop Simon Cowell in his tracks and change the way he saw his role on that stage forever. But what happened next, when Simon stood up, walked away from the judge's desk, and broke every rule of the show, no one in that theater, or watching at home, could ever forget. If you want to know how a 9-year-old child brought the toughest judge in television to his knees, subscribe now, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. 3 weeks earlier, in a small town outside Pittsburgh, a boy named Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. His mother watched from the doorway, her arms folded tightly across her chest, eyes red from crying. She'd been crying a lot lately. Ever since the diagnosis. Ethan had been born deaf. For 9 years, he had navigated a world built for people who could hear, learning to read lips, to communicate with his hands, to feel vibrations in music even though he couldn't hear the notes. He was used to being different. But this was something else. 2 months ago, his younger sister, Lily, had been diagnosed with a rare heart condition. The doctors said she needed surgery, expensive, complicated surgery that the family couldn't afford. The fundraisers had helped, but it wasn't enough. His mother had taken on 2 extra jobs. His father worked nights. And still, it wasn't enough. Ethan didn't understand all the details, but he understood one thing: his sister was in danger, and he felt helpless. That's when he saw the commercial. America's Got Talent. A golden buzzer. A chance to win. A stage where people who had something to say could be heard, even if they couldn't speak. He turned to his mother and signed. "I want to try." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, you don't have to do this. You're just a child." But Ethan's hands moved with a determination she'd never seen before. "I have something to say. And I want the world to hear it." His mother didn't argue. She couldn't. Because deep down, she knew that sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest truths. The audition tape was simple. Ethan, standing alone in their living room, signing directly into the camera. No background music. No theatrics. Just a boy, his hands, and a message. The producers at AGT received thousands of audition tapes every season. Most were filed away, forgotten. But when they watched Ethan's video, something stopped them. It wasn't polished. It wasn't flashy. But it was real. One producer replayed the video 3 times, then walked it straight to the executive team. "We need this kid on the show," he said. "This is why we do this." 2 weeks later, Ethan and his family were on a plane to Los Angeles. The backstage area of America's Got Talent is controlled chaos. Dancers stretching, singers warming up their voices, magicians rehearsing tricks. Ethan sat quietly in a corner with his mother, watching it all unfold. He wasn't nervous. He'd made peace with what he was about to do. A producer approached, clipboard in hand, speaking quickly. Ethan's mother translated into sign language. The producer explained the format: walk on stage, wait for Simon's signal, then begin. 3 minutes. That's all he had. Ethan signed back. "I only need 2. The producer smiled, though she didn't fully understand yet what she was about to witness. As Ethan waited in the wings, he could hear the roar of the crowd, or rather, feel it. The vibrations traveled through the floor, into his feet, up his spine. He closed his eyes and thought of Lily. He thought of his parents, exhausted and afraid. He thought of all the families like his, struggling in silence, unseen by a world that moved too fast to notice. He opened his eyes. It was time. The stage manager waved him forward. Ethan stepped into the light. The moment Ethan walked onto that stage, the entire energy of the room shifted, and Simon Cowell felt it before he even knew why. Simon had judged thousands of acts. He prided himself on reading people within seconds, the fakers, the dreamers, the ones who had real talent and the ones who were wasting everyone's time. But this child, standing alone in the spotlight, didn't fit any category he recognized. Simon uncrossed his arms. "Hello?" he said, leaning into the microphone. "What's your name?" Ethan didn't respond. He just stood there, hands at his sides, looking directly at Simon. The audience stirred, confused. Howie leaned over to Sophia. "Is this part of the act?" Simon frowned, glancing toward the wings, expecting a translator or a parent to step forward. No one came. Then Ethan's mother's voice came softly over the speaker system, calm and clear. "His name is Ethan. He's 9 years old. And he can't hear you." The audience gasped. Simon sat back in his chair, processing. A deaf child. On a talent show. This was uncharted territory, even for him. "All right, Ethan," Simon said slowly, unsure if the boy could even see his lips from that distance. "What are you going to do for us today?" Ethan lifted his hands and began to sign. His mother's voice translated, soft but steady. "I'm going to tell you a story. Not with my voice. With my hands. I'm going to tell you about my sister. About my family. About people like me who the world forgets to listen to." Simon's jaw tightened. He glanced at the other judges. No one knew what to say. "All right," Simon finally said, his voice softer than usual. "Show us." The stage lights dimmed. A single spotlight remained on Ethan. No music. No sound. Just silence. And then, Ethan's hands began to move. At first, the signs were slow, almost tentative. But within seconds they became fluid, expressive, powerful. His entire body became part of the language, his face, his posture, the tilt of his head. He wasn't just signing. He was performing. On the screens above the stage, his mother's voice translated in real time, but even without the words, everyone in that theater understood. They understood because Ethan's emotion was universal. He signed about his sister. About the hospital visits. About watching his parents cry when they thought he wasn't looking. About feeling invisible in a world that only listened to those who could speak. And then, Ethan signed something that made Simon Cowell do something he had never done in 15 years of judging talent shows. Ethan's hands slowed. His face grew serious. And he signed directly towards Simon, locking eyes with him across the stage. The translation came through the speakers. "People think that because I can't hear, I don't understand. But I see everything. I see my mom working 3 jobs. I see my dad too tired to smile. I see my sister getting sicker. And I see a world that only pays attention when someone is loud." Ethan paused, his hands hovering in the air. "But I don't need to be loud. Because the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs to be seen." The audience was dead silent. Not a cough. Not a whisper. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Simon Cowell stood up. Not to leave. Not to walk off in frustration like he'd done 100 times before when an act didn't meet his standards. He stood because something inside him had cracked open, something he'd spent years building walls around. He stepped out from behind the judge's desk. Howie reached out, confused, as if to stop him, but Simon was already moving toward the stage. The producers in the control room panicked. "What is he doing?" One of them hissed into the headset. "Simon, stay at the desk. Simon." But Simon wasn't listening. He climbed the stairs to the stage, slowly, deliberately, and walked toward Ethan. The boy didn't move. He just watched Simon approach, his small hands still poised in mid-sign. Simon stopped a few feet away from him. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of his face. The lines around his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. And then, Simon Cowell did something no one expected. He knelt down. On one knee, at eye level with Ethan, Simon looked at the boy and said quietly, almost to himself, "I've spent my whole life telling people whether they're good enough, whether they deserve to be here. But you," his voice cracked, "you just taught me something I should have learned a long time ago." Ethan tilted his head, reading Simon's lips. Simon continued, his voice steadier now. "You don't need my permission. You don't need a golden buzzer. You don't need anything from me. Because what you just did, what you just said, that's more important than any song, any dance, any performance I've ever seen on this stage." The audience erupted into applause, but Simon raised his hand, silencing them. He wasn't finished. He looked back at Ethan and spoke slowly, making sure the boy could read every word. "But I'm going to give you something anyway. Not because you need it, but because the world needs to see this. The world needs to hear you." Simon stood, walked back toward the judge's desk, and without hesitation, slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer. Golden confetti exploded from the ceiling. The audience roared. The other judges shot to their feet, clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes. Ethan's mother collapsed into sobs backstage, her hands covering her face. But Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, in the center of the stage, surrounded by falling golden paper, his hands still forming one final sign. "Thank you?" Simon stood at the judge's desk, staring at the boy, his own eyes glistening. And for the first time in his career, Simon Cowell didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because sometimes silence says everything. After the show, backstage, Ethan sat with his mother, still holding the golden buzzer trophy they'd given him as a prop. His mother was crying again, but this time, they were different tears. A production assistant approached, hesitant. "Mr. Cowell would like to speak with you, if that's okay." Ethan's mother looked at her son, who nodded. Simon entered the room quietly, hands in his pockets. He looked older somehow, more human. He sat down across from Ethan and his mother, and for a long moment, he just looked at the boy. Finally, Simon spoke. "I don't usually do this. I don't usually get involved off camera. But I made some calls." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and handed it to Ethan's mother. "It's not everything. But it's enough to cover your daughter's surgery. And then some." Ethan's mother's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. Her eyes went wide. She looked at Simon, then at Ethan, then back at Simon, unable to speak. Simon stood. "You came here to be heard. And you were. But more than that, you reminded me why I do this job. It's not about finding the next big star. It's about finding the next big truth." He looked at Ethan one more time, and this time, he signed. It was clumsy, unpracticed, but clear. "Thank you?" Ethan smiled, the first real smile he'd given all day, and signed back. "You're welcome." Simon left the room without another word. But as he walked down the hall, away from the cameras, away from the lights, one of the producers saw him stop, lean against the wall, and wipe his eyes. Even Simon Cowell, the man who had built a career on being unbreakable, had been broken. Not by talent. Not by skill. But by a 9-year-old boy who reminded him that the most powerful performances aren't the ones that make noise. They're the ones that make you listen. Ethan never won America's Got Talent. He didn't need to. Because that night, he won something far more valuable. He gave a voice to the voiceless. He reminded the world that being heard has nothing to do with volume. And Simon Cowell? He never forgot that moment. Years later, in interviews, when asked about his most memorable act, he wouldn't talk about chart-topping singers or viral dancers. He'd talk about a 9-year-old boy who taught him how to listen. If this story touched you, share it. Subscribe so moments like this are never forgotten. Because the world needs more people like Ethan. And fewer people who only listen to the loudest voice in the room.